one day my associate asked and said, I want you to come out to Norton Air Force Base with me, and we're going to investigate possibilities of specials. They had this man named Paul Shartle, whose name I don't mind saying anymore. We went into a screening room that was called a clean room, where there's monitors in most of those Air Force installations. So he began to tell us about, he said, would you be interested in knowing that we had a landing at Holloman Air Force Base of an alien craft? And having come from a position of thinking, as my wife used to talk about UFOs, and I used to think it's sort of like it's Bigfoot and the Easter Bunny and things like that. I absolutely could not believe what this man was telling me. His name was on the walls as head of security at Norton for the depository, or it's called DAVA, Defense Audio-Visual Agency out there. So he said that also a man named Al Lorenzo, who he knew, was one of the attendants to one of the beings at Holloman, and had warned him, and had apprised him that this film was taken and the landing took place. And so he implied that the 600 or 800 feet of 16 millimeter film was available. So, so I bid for it. We all did. It was sort of like a carrot. He said, are you interested? And we said, I think it's kind of far out. Of course, let's pursue it. But he said, he kind of gave us a warning. He said, look, as a decoy, the word is not decoy, I don't mean it was a decoy, but he said, I suggest that you bury it under about 3 or 4 other projects. We headed for the Pentagon, and we walked into the building. I remember the two of us, and for some reason we were sort of herded by 2 plainclothesmen into a little narrow room with fluorescent lights over it. And I just remember, and some man sitting behind a desk, he pointed at us and said, we're very concerned about you bringing up the subject of UFOs. And he said it causes that when people like you, like me, put these things on the air, it causes the phone lines to be so, it ties up our phone lines. It is not a part of our assignment and our duty or national defense, and on and on. And I was under the fluorescent lights and watching these 3 plainclothesmen and all. I thought I was going to die there for a minute. But my partner had enough sense to say, hey, we were invited here by Mr. Hatch, by Colonel Coleman, and they said, okay, well, just a warning. So off we go to meet, we went off to meet Colonel Coleman. Now, he was the one that looks like Hemingway with a beard walking through the E-ring at the Pentagon. The first thing he said to us was, if you come across information or technology or that is not in the interest of or against the interest of our national defense, he said, you can be fined and imprisoned. So it was like, warning number 2. Then we went into his inner office, and a strange thing happened. He said, come on, boys, sit down. Let me tell you something. He said, when I was piloting a B-25 over Alabama with a 7-man crew, he said, I saw one of those things, and we pursued it. He said I pushed that 25 up to 350 knots. I couldn't keep up with it, but we followed it. He said he saw it go across a plowed field in Alabama, and you could see the vortexes of dirt flipping up under it. He reported it to Blue Book, and he said when he looked for that particular file later, it disappeared, because here it would be very strange that here's Coleman interfacing with the press all the time, giving the story about there's no evidence this exists, yet behind the scenes, we all know now that he has seen them and he knows. So he doesn't deny it at all. The next thing he did was say, let me put you in touch with, I want to make a phone call over to Colonel Weinbrenner. He's commander of foreign technology. Well, the little I knew about UFOs, it's like foreign technology is the secret place where everything happens. You always see the name of it. It's where the 3 little green bodies are in the basement, so we've been told, and where Hangar 18 is just outside there. Anyway, we went into the bunker. It's guarded, and there are surveillance cameras everywhere you go, and it's somewhat down underground. And finally we came to Colonel Weinbrenner's office, went in, and he's sitting behind his desk, smoking a cigar, and I walked up to his desk and said, "Colonel, what about the landing of an alien craft at Holloman Air Force Base?" And he took a puff of his cigar and he started walking around. He said, "Goddamn Russians," he said, or we try and spy on them and they know everything about us. And he went over to a blackboard and he started drawing pictures of MiG-25s. And he says, "We don't know much about them. We have to go to the Paris Air Show, but we publish everything." And I thought, man, wait a minute. Maybe he didn't hear what I said. And then he went on to a little rage. He says, "The thing we've got to worry about is weather alteration." He says, "The Soviets are way ahead of us in that technology." And he says, "But I've got the best scientists working on counter strategies." So by this time I was really trying to track. I sat down in a chair and he went over to his library bookshelf. He said, "I got some of the best scientists working on it." He pulled a book off the shelf, plopped it down in my lap, and I opened it, and it said, "To my good friend, Colonel Weinbrenner, signed Dr. Alan Hynek," and the book was on UFOs. So it was like, maybe, he sort of knows what I'm talking about a little bit. And then he started going on a little rampage about this Mexican colonel that he had, I think he didn't give him that high a rank at the time, but he said, he's putting out stories right and left. I don't know what, and I didn't know what he was talking about, except the next day, Hector Quintanilla, which you saw in the film, called us and said, "Gee, George Weinbrenner said that I had to get in touch with you." So it was all this kind of wonderful Kafka play, and, like you're not sure what anybody's saying. We had Bob Baker. We analyzed we had some films which you don't see in here, but we were given a film, a top secret, it was still top secret on it, Quintanilla's name was on it, of a launching at Vandenberg, of which 3 cameras followed the one missile takeoff, and behind it you saw 2 little white, look like transparent moons, just sort of trailing and following it their way, but in every camera, no matter what position, so it wasn't a reflection. So we had Bob Baker, who was the guy who did the 1952 Robertson panel guy. I don't know if these names mean anything to you. Anyway, Bob Baker was well known at that time. So he came in and analyzed it and said, it's 1,000,001 that it's anything but, it's not the Venus, it's not a reflection, it's unknown stuff. We had a major that was assigned to us called Major Verana, Leo Verana. He was a real nice guy. As you probably know, it's been tipped already. At the last, we got the production going pretty well, and the film that we were supposed to, I guess naively thought, well, we'll just put the film in here. Coleman, along with someone else at the Pentagon, decided to pull the film back to the Pentagon. And I know it was driven back by, the name of the guy slipped my mind, but he had to drive back with his wife in a Honda, and I'd heard with the film cans in the back, and I heard these little stories about how the car broke down somewhere, and these 2 heavy-set people were sleeping in has nothing to do with UFOs, I suppose. They were trying to sleep in some motel, and I got all the sort of details of how the film finally ended up back at the Pentagon. And when I asked Coleman why, I went back, we had a hot dog in the center of the Pentagon, there's a little hot dog stand, and I was walking along, I said, why would you pull that? And he said, well, I'll give you 10, you can ask 10 questions. I said, was it a real landing? No. Was it this? Was it that? Was it that? And by the time I was through, there really wasn't any answer, and I had my 10 questions. I couldn't think of any more. Then later on, by the way, I've talked to him, and he says, well, it's because we had lenses that were developed that we didn't want, the film would show that we had lenses that we didn't want the Soviets to know. Then it was something else, a year later it's something else. It never has resolved. I talk to the guy all the time, by the way, and we're very good friends. But I still have not gotten to the bottom of it. Anyway, so we had to recreate the Holloman ending. I'm not happy that we used animation, or it wasn't even animation, drawings. It was a last-minute thing. And my Alan Sandler said, well, we're going to have to go down to Holloman and film this thing. So he got on the phone, called the commander, got the commander of Holloman Air Force Base and said, we'd like to come down there and film do a little filming, so forth and so on. The guy said, "You want to come down here and do what?" He said, "This is a high security base. Forget it." Blink. So we called Leo Verana, who's still with us, and he said, "Oh, give me 5-10 minutes." So 5 or 10 minutes later, get that commander on the phone. He said, "Well, come on down here. What are you?" We had to change when we made the film. This is something that's out of sequence that people should know, and that is when Rod Serling says, "How would they react to this event?" Well, the editor, who's a fairly he had won an Emmy, so we're going to argue with him. He had taken the Holloman incident and moved it to the very end. The social psychologists were talking about the landing at Holloman Air Force Base. We gave them the total scenario. We said, here's what happened. I gave them a one-page scenario, and Leon Festinger, this is all, we had to pay for this, you know. These guys are not just doing it for the heck of it. So all of those social psychologists wrote all what you heard them saying based on the scenario of the Holloman landing. But we did our film, as you know, it went on the air, went into syndication, which isn't the way I'd like to have seen it. So, but on its first airing, it did get an immense rating of 48 shares, quite high. And they said they had about 500 phone calls that they couldn't screen out. And then it went on to be nominated for a Golden Globe Award, which I thought was nice for considering the subject, you know, UFOs. So much for the Holloman thing. I thought I'd tell you that what happened later in the 80s, I sort of put it aside and went back to, you know, selling potato chips for gray advertising and Hondas and Bank of America and all of those things. And during the Reagan administration, I got a call from a Bob Scott. I had met him before. He was head of USIA back in earlier. He was a Pentagon agency head for DAVA and was out at Norton again. His assistant was a General Glenn E. Miller, retired general, who was vice commander. And I got calls, and they would come out, and they came to our house several times saying that we'd liked what you did back then, and we'd like to do something new. And what I was trying to figure out was this. I kept asking, is this the administration's idea, or is it your idea, or what? And that was never very clear to me, what it was. But I can't imagine that a Pentagon agency guy just comes out to your house and sits around and raps, and I would meet them at Sizzlers, you know, and we'd go over stuff. Now, here's where we get back to Miller and the gang. Hynek came to my house, all excited about the Hudson Valley sightings. He brought some tapes, and I picked him up at the airport, and Miller said he was going to meet us at my house. And Hynek we were sitting around waiting for him, and finally Miller sort of walked in and said, well, he said they're voice activated. And I remember Hynek kind of looking at him and said, what? What do you mean? He says, the UFO crafts, they're voice activated. He had told me that he had witnessed the interior of one and just kind of blurted this out to poor old Dr. Hynek, who my wife said Hynek's face dropped with all of a sudden a realization that maybe he had never really been allowed to know too much about what was going on inside. Confirmed with, I'd say about a month ago, I had a conversation with Coleman and Friend, and they confirmed, they said that Hynek was never given a top secret or given real clearance. They didn't want to spend the money, which would have cost the government about $100,000. So in a way, he never would know. He never saw his dream of really understanding the whole phenomenon. And I think he was a wonderful guy, by the way. I talked to Colonel Friend and Coleman. I talked to them quite often. But Friend said an interesting thing after all the dust had settled, which was something to the effect, he said, in retrospect, looking back, he said, we had a great enthusiasm and bias to come to a certain conclusion about the UFO phenomenon. He said, but at this time, he believes if we went back and looked at the same evidence and material, he believes that they would come to much different conclusions. So I thought that was a kind of an interesting admission, that times change. And I think that all those guys believe the phenomenon is real. I don't remember any of them denying it. But so there's hope.
Didn't you also say that recently, when you asked the question again about why they withdrew it, he said something about, well, we didn't have diplomatic relations with...
Yeah, I thought that was the last time I talked to Coleman, and I talked to him quite often. I really like these guys. They're very... Coleman, for instance, is very tuned in. He's been criticized as being, the PR front. But he said he had to be informed about everything, because if the question is asked, he has to know. He doesn't have to answer it, but he has to know what's going on. He said to me, the last thing he said was, well, okay, the reason why we didn't show that film or allow you to have it was that the beings that you saw, or the people that you saw, are from a place or / country that we do not have diplomatic relations with, and therefore it would be revealing something that we didn't want to be known internationally. Well, the thing that's sort of funny about that is that these people look like Sumerians. In fact, there's a whole thing of the Sitchin people who are saying, for God's sakes, these look like the gods of the Sumerians who, came down from wherever. Now, either they never changed their dress, or, after 6,000 or 7,000 years, I don't know. But I thought, well, from that point of view, that's kind of amusing. It's like, hey, we don't have relationships with the gods of Iraq. We don't want the public to know that. That's the only thing that I, could figure out.
My name is Charles Daly, and I want to ask a question that perhaps you can clear up for me, and maybe the others too. At the beginning of the film, we were told that these were accurate representations, that these statements were true. And I assume the pictures were true too.
Yes.
Now, if this be true, how can you depict a film that was withdrawn, and I take it nobody got to view? How can you simulate it?
Well, because we sat with those who had viewed it, with like a police sketch artist. I knew as much scenario as where the buildings were, where the places were, and how the crafts came down, which camera shot what. And the being it didn't come out of the mind of an imaginative person. It came out of saying, it looked like this, it looked like this, it looked like this. And it was it was just like, sometimes police sketches are good or they're bad, but this came as close as to that, those who witnessed it and saw it. That's
You did have conversations with those who did see the film.
Oh, absolutely. We sat many times. That's why we did the project in the first place, were those who guided us as to what it looked like.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Your friend is Coleman, is that his name?
William Coleman, yes.
Well, as far as I understand, you haven't seen the Holloman film yourself?
Right.
Well, didn't you just say his latest explanation? He said the people you saw. Didn't you say those words?
Did I say that?
Well, it'll be on tape if you did. And also, in the footage that was at the end of the documentary you did, there's one little small piece.
I know. It was shot at Holloman.
Okay, and that's an airplane?
It was something, wasn't it? It was something.
So you're saying you did not see the film yourself, even though you went all the way to Washington, D.C., and you were just going along for the ride, and being a producer, you wouldn't have viewed this film before you would put it in a documentary?
Well, somebody else asked that. It never occurred to me that maybe in a naive way that we wouldn't be able to put it at the end. Now, in retrospect, it was sort of foolish to think that they would just simply say, oh, go ahead and put it in. I mean, it would be the most startling news, world news, that could happen in reality. And we weren't privileged to bring that startling news except in a different form, saying this might happen. I mean, we had to do that. Number one, I started 3 or 4 months before that, not even believing in it. I don't think I ever got up to speed to even question anything. You just start rolling, you know. I wish that it isn't over yet. It still isn't over. If this thing is around, it still may surface. Others have seen it. I just haven't had that privilege yet.
Is this to imply that after the Air Force landing that the aircraft and the beings did not take off?
I got that impression that there was a period of time where the craft was put into a hangar, and I don't know what kind of an exchange might have gone on.
So nobody gave you any information in terms of what conversation took place? What was said?
The description was they look like where they acted like professors, PhDs. I don't know how they communicated. I know I should have an answer for that.
No, but nobody ever gave you any kind of idea what took place in the conversation between
Only the business of asking them if they were to help identify radio signals, of which they said they weren't their signals. I don't know, again, if I could ever find Alfonso Lorenzo or a couple other people, it would be a lot easier. He sort of, to me, was the key to it.
Maybe talk about some of your own personal views, and have you ever seen anything other than what you didn't see at Holloman?
There was enough evidence. I mean, even if you took the cases that, first of all, when we started our project, they said, well, you know, we've had 12,000 cases. And I said, that's fine. Let's talk about the ones you couldn't solve, because that's going to be interesting. No problem. And that's what we did in the film. These were all unsolved in their mind. And I saw enough documents about this stuff, especially poor old Lonnie Zamaro, scared to death still. There's no question that something landed there. I have no doubt that this phenomenon is real, and that we've had some exchange. I think it's a real phenomenon. And I think someday we're going to, I don't know which government is going to let it out, or who's going to let it out with the documentation, but we'll know. I mean, it's a reality.